Remember when you were young, you shone like the sun.
Tonicization is one of the most useful and popular ways to enrich our harmonic language. Today I want to discuss non-traditional tonicization, different types of tonicization and techniques that are used mostly in popular music. Let's start with reminding ourselves what tonicization is. This circle reflects the diatonic system. All the chords that you see inside this circle are based on notes that belong to the key. The goal of tonicization is to let one of these chords that is not a tonic shine for a brief moment, being more stabilized, feel like a tonic in a temporary key. You can tonicize the 2 chord, you can tonicize the 3 chord, the 4 chord. In fact, you can tonicize each one of these chords except for the diminished triad, because there's no key whose tonic is a diminished triad. So how do we make this chord shine? We're making it sound like a tonic by using chords that belong to this temporary key. Traditional tonicization uses secondary dominant chords. For instance, the 5 chord in the key of 4, or the diminished 7 in the key of 4. If you want to emphasize this tendency, we can add a 7, making these chords even more dominant, even more desiring to resolve into this temporary tonic. For instance, if we're in the key of G, and I want to tonicize C major, this is my 4 chord, I can use either G7 and then go back home to my main key, or I can use B diminished. Same idea, I'm tonicizing C major with a chord that belongs to the key of C major, and then back home. So the concept of tonicization is very similar to modulation, but it's a bit different. The main difference is timing. Tonicization is done briefly. Tonicization means we're just visiting another key for a brief moment. 1 chord, 2 chords, 3 chords, and then we go back home. While modulation is really moving to another key. So if you see this circle, imagine we move into another complete circle. We might not even come back home. Sometimes we modulate and we stay in the new place. Tonicization, the idea is always that we are still in this main key all the time. It also depends on the length of the piece. If we're talking about a 30-minute symphony or a 4-hour opera, then you can tonicize a degree and stay there for good 2-3 minutes, maybe even more, and you would still maybe consider it only a local tonicization. In pop and rock songs, in which the average song lasts for 3-4 minutes, then if the chorus is in a different key, we're usually going to call it modulation and not tonicization, even if it lasts only for 20 seconds. So let's switch now to less traditional tonicization, and we will start with tonicization that uses predominant chords. For instance, the 4 of 4 and the 2 of 4 in order to tonicize this 4 chord in the main key. Let's start with George Harrison's song, All Things Must Pass. And now, so what happens here is that in the key of E major, George Harrison tonicizes the 4 chord A major using its own minor 2. All things must pass, and then going back home to the tonic. This is a different sound than tonicizing this A chord with a much more traditional secondary dominant. All things must pass. Much more subtle, and in a way fits better the style of the song. Something is very smooth about it and less directional. Duran Duran's song Rio does a similar thing, now tonicizing the 4 chord with its own 4.
Her name is Rio and she dances on the sand, just like that river twisting through a dusty land.
So what we have here is a 1 chord, followed by 5, and then 4 of 4, following by 4. And it's really a sequence. The relationship between these 2 chords is the same as between these 2 chords. Now, some would prefer to call this chord flat 7, which is completely legit. In this context, I prefer 4 of 4 because this is the way this chord behaves. I find that this creates what we call a plagal cadence of 4 to 1 in this specific temporary key of A major. Beethoven does a similar thing in the first movement of his Waldstein's piano sonata. So he uses the same basic idea of 1 chord going to 5 chord, and then 4 of 4 going to 4 chord. Similarly to Duran Duran, but a bit different. First of all, Beethoven adds more tonicizations using the traditional concept of secondary dominant. So in C major we start from tonic, and then 5 of 5 before going to 5 in first inversion. And then 4 of 4, 5 of 4 before going to 4 chord in first inversion. Another difference is that Beethoven's progression relies heavily on voice leading, especially this chromatic descending bass line. Making this 4 of 4 chromatic chord pretty natural and smooth on the ear, much more so than in Duran Duran's example, which in this key would sound like this, which is a bit harsher and more direct, more typical for popular music that prefers more direct progressions, less inversions, and relies less on voice leading. Now, does tonicization work in the minor key as well? Yes, but is much less common. So let's look for an example that tonicizes the 4 chord, now it is the minor chord, using its own 4. We're going to listen to Marche d'Endorma's song, 3 Kisses. So similarly to Duran Duran and Beethoven, the sequence here helps making it work. Tonic chord goes to 5, and then 4 of 4 resolve into 4. In all of the examples I just shared, the secondary chord precedes the temporary tonic. In other words, we have a chromatic chord that prepares the following tonic to shine, to become more stable. But you can do it the other way around. For instance, in Queen's song, Crazy Little Thing Called Love. So this is the tonic, D major. We are first introduced with the 4 chord, and then we have 4 of 4 in order to color this G chord. Back to the G, back to 1. An even more interesting example will be the Beatles song, I Don't Want to Spoil the Party.
to show. There's nothing for me here, so I will disappear. If she turns up while I'm gone, please let me know.
So the song is in G major, and then we get to a 5 chord, and to a 6 chord, and after the 6 appears, we have 5/7 of 6. So this is a tonicization that occurs after the fact, after the temporary tonic. And then we go somewhere else. In other words, this B7 is not there to prepare something that is about to happen. Rather, it is a secondary dominant that looks backward. And it really fits and reflects the despair in the lyrics. Imagine you're in this party, which you don't want to spoil, but there's nothing for you here. It's not only the fact that we have this minor chord here. If Lennon would have sung, "There's nothing for me here," that would not have done it, right? "There's nothing for me here." He's really tonicizing this E minor, which happens to be the tonic of the relative key. It's a very stable chord. Similar thing happens in the lyrics of the second verse.
I've had a drink or two and I don't care. There's no fun in what I do when she's not there. I wonder what went wrong. I waited far too long.
Without the tonicization, this would have been, "I wonder what went wrong." But now we have, "I wonder what went wrong," and we feel something went wrong because we have this tonicization of the 6th chord that has just happened. I just want to mention one more cool phenomenon of tonicizing using a borrowed chord that is altered and is borrowed from the parallel key. For instance, if I want to tonicize the chord of A minor, I can use major 4. It's a very common alter chord. And some theorists view it as a borrowed chord, a chord that is borrowed from the parallel key of A major. So for instance, it is used exactly this way in the Beatles song, Something.
Something in the way she moves attracts me like no other lover. Something in the way she woos me.
And now we go into the temporary tonic.
I don't want to leave her now. You know I believe in how.
A similar example is tonicization using what we call flat 6th chord. If I want to make, say, B flat major chord sounds like a temporary tonic, I can precede it with a flat 6. This is exactly what happens in Pink Floyd's song Shine On You Crazy Diamond, where we have tonic in G minor going to G flat. And what this G flat does is tonicizing B flat major, which is the 3 chord of the original key. Let's listen.
Remember when you were young, you shone like the sun. Shine on, you crazy diamond.
Now let's look at a few ways we can employ these different tonicization techniques in songwriting or in arrangement. Let's take a simple melody in the key of C major, and I first just accompany it with diatonic chords only. Started with a tonic, C major, and then went to 4. Now let's try to tonicize this 4 to give it a boost of stability, kind of letting it shine a bit more. So this will be, and now this is the 5 of 4. This is the most traditional tonicization, 5 of 4, secondary dominant, by introducing this note that is foreign to my main key, but is an integral part of my secondary key, you could say, or temporary key, F major. Now, if you want to take the jazzy approach, instead of doing just 5 to 1 secondary dominant, we're going to do 2, 5, 1 into my temporary key. And by the way, there's a reason why first time I have an F chord, I have it in this inversion, keeping my pedal tone here in the bass. The reason is I don't want to waste my F chord, my F bass. I want to keep it fresh for the time it arrives as a temporary tonic. Listen. If I waste it here, it doesn't sound fresh here. If I save it, now, and maybe even in this octave, it makes it sound fresh. Now, this 2-5-1 can actually exist over the same bass, a bit of a different color. Sus chord, this will sound like this. Now let's try less traditional tonicization. What if I want to tonicize this F chord with its predominant? So I'm having a secondary predominant rather than secondary dominant. 4 of 4. It's a bit more for a rock music approach rather than jazz. Now, another variation will be to take this chord, minorize it, and then resolve it. This is a trick I learned from Israeli composer Professor Menachem Tzur. And the trick is that every major triad you take, once you minorize it, you make it sound like a 4 chord. Check it on any key, A flat major, A flat minor, sound like a 4 chord to this. So you can go either to a major tonic or minor tonic. Okay, so back to our song. B flat minor, tonicize F in a very neat way. And again, probably we're going to go back to our original key soon. Lastly, we can tonicize a different chord. Let's tonicize a diatonic minor chord, maybe E minor, which is my 3rd scale degree. Okay, this 3 chord. So instead of doing 4 to 3, the diatonic approach, let's do 5 of 3. Now this chord is a bit harsh or surprising on the ear because it has 2 dissonances, 2 new notes foreign to the key. So what we can do is introduce them gradually. You hear that it's less offensive on the ear because I first introduced the F sharp and only then the D sharp. I'm just using this sus4 trick, so. And of course I can do the same 2-5-1 that we used before. In a minor key it works a bit differently because 2-5-1 in minor uses this half diminished chord. And the nice thing is that half diminished 7th chord has a tendency to sound like a 2 chord no matter what. You walk on the street, you hear half diminished chord. It's very likely this is your tonic. C sharp half diminished, probably tonic is B minor. Doesn't have to, but it's very common. So, in theory, you can just take this chord and use this to tonicize E minor without even going through the 5. One more time. 2 half diminished of 3 going to 3. But if you prefer the jazzy version, then use the 2-5. Sounds a bit like a Billy Joel song, right? Once we add all these 2-5s. And if you prefer the more rocky version, maybe no tonicization here, but in the next video I'm going to show a few more ways to use tonicization. the double plagal cadence, the super plagal cadence, tonicization that uses an invisible tonic, and the way the Beatles song I'm Only Sleeping using tonicization to change our perspective of how we listen to the verse of the song.